All right, we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to co-chair, as always, as it has been for several years now, this Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs, with Professor Eric Arneson of George Washington University. We are delighted today to feature John Connolly with his new masterful, but will I'm sure soon be a classic history of Eastern Europe. It'll be, I think, a really exciting discussion. The Washington History Seminar is, as many of you know, a co-production of two organizations, the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the National History Center of the American Historical Association, Eric being the president of the center currently. We are in our 10th year of holding these sessions, and time has flown by. Let me do a couple of preliminaries before I turn it over to my co-chair to moderate the discussion and introduce our featured speaker. We'd like to thank the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest at Villanova University, as well as the George Washington University History Department for their financial support. We really appreciate this support, especially during these times. We also have a number of anonymous donors who make these meetings possible, and we welcome contributions from any of you in the audience. Details about how to support this effort will appear in the chat function shortly. You can give either to the National History Center or the Wilson Center. Behind the scenes, there are a couple of individuals that really carry the weight of organizing this event. Rachel Wheatley, the Assistant Director of the National History Center, and Pete Bierstecker on my team, the History and Public Policy Program. Just a quick explanation of how we'll proceed. Eric, I'll turn it over to Eric in a moment. And moderate the discussion, introduce the speaker, and then we'll have, hopefully fairly quickly, invite all of you to a Q&A discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, please click the raise hand button on the Zoom. Once you press the button, you will be entered into a queue, which only the presenters can view. When the moderator calls on you, you will receive the prompt that will ask you to unmute your screen. Please press the yes button, or you will not be able to be understood by anyone else. Once you have asked your question, you will be muted again. If you would like to ask another question, you will have to raise your hand again and get in line, I'm afraid. You may also submit questions to Rachel Wheatley via the email provided in the chat function. I think that captures all of the preliminaries, and with that, I'm more than delighted to turn it over to Eric for the introductions of our keynote speaker. Eric.
Thank you, Christian. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce John Connolly, who is the Sidney Hellman Ehrman Professor of History and the Director of the Institute for East Europe, European, Eurasian, and Slavic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. His books include Captive University, The Sovietization of Eastern Germany, Czech and Polish Higher Education, 1945 to 1956, which appeared in 2000, From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution and Catholic Teaching on the Jews in 2012. He has written for Commonweal, The Nation, the London Review of Books, the Washington Post, and the New Republic, amongst other venues. And today we'll be focused on his most recent book, From Peoples into Nations, A History of Eastern Europe, published by Princeton University Press earlier this year. John, the screen is yours.
Thanks so much for the invitation to speak to you about my recent book. I suppose the first question that one asks about a book like this is, why another book on this subject? There are a lot of excellent books on Eastern Europe that go back many decades. I think what I wanted to do was try to explain to readers what I've been trying to explain to students for the last 30 or so years, why the region, this region, Eastern Europe or East Central Europe, I use them interchangeably, in fact, is a region, and what makes it distinct, what makes it interesting, instructive, why people should care about it. In some excellent recent work, I think the trend has been to say that Eastern Europe is a creation of outsiders, primarily of Western travelers, and that if Eastern Europe exists, it's as an idea imposed upon the region from people from the outside. Eastern Europe, in this telling, is not really that different from other places. People talk about global Europe, thus why not global Poland or global Hungary? I saw at the most recent AHA, there was a panel on the global and transnational Habsburg Empire. We live in an age which aspires to diversity as one of its highest values, but which ironically hesitates to say that any human being, any human community might be distinctive. But my own experience from the first times I visited Eastern Europe in the 1970s, first East Germany, then Poland, and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, what struck me in visiting the region was that I was encountering there at the level of mentality, something that I hadn't encountered elsewhere, something special and distinctive. That it was a place I found in conversations with people with unusual sensitivity to history, where the events and deeds of earlier times mattered in ways that I had not encountered growing up in Philadelphia. Eastern Europe, or East Central Europe, was a place where people thought of history as akin to a personality that might intervene in your life, in the life of your family, that might knock at the door, become the guest seated in the living room who never leaves, a guest who does not suffer being ignored, a presence that might suddenly disrupt all conventions, the entire built world of towns and cities, and reveal them as what they are, products of history. I think you get a sense of this unusual sensitivity in the recollections, the memoir of Czesław Miłosz, the poet, the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, who spent the war years mostly in Warsaw, and he, in his memoir, compares the streets and pavements of that city to liquid, something that at any moment could escape the temporary form given in stone and asphalt. I think the point was even truer of political and economic systems for Miłosz, all of which naive people in the West considered to be eternal, constitutional democracy, for example, but East Europeans understood are historically contingent. Is this kind of sensitivity unique? Not exactly. Earlier this year, I had the pleasant experience of enjoying a sabbatical in Belfast, and I discovered that Northern Ireland shares three things with historical Eastern Europe. First thing, more than one people living in the same space and considering this space to be their own. Second, one of these people seeming to be post-imperial. In Northern Ireland, these are the so-called loyalists. And third, both peoples, so two peoples at least, having a keen sense of their community's fate being at the mercy of larger forces, especially of larger states. I think what is unusual about Eastern Europe is how this kind of sensitivity of being a small people, subjected to the whims of larger peoples, is reproduced across a significant stretch of Earth. Eastern Europe, if you will, is like a series of Ulsters, Northern Irelands, going from the Baltic to the Adriatic Seas, wedged between imperial peoples to the east and imperial peoples to the west. Aside from being very conscious of very old history, knowing, for example, the precise dates, even times of day of events hundreds of years old, say the Battle of Grunvault, sometimes known as Tannenberg, which a Polish friend of mine matter-of-factly told me one day, surprising me, was not only on the 15th of July, 1410, but early that morning. And of course, everyone knew it was a Wednesday. East Europe, I think, is even better known for producing new history, not just ancient history, but new history. Indeed, much of what we associate with the 20th century, its wars, social movements, political ideologies, grand experiments, and superb culture, its Miłoshes, but also Kertészes, Kunderas, Krauses, its Andriches, was experienced as intensely in Eastern Europe as anywhere on the globe. In a sense, Eastern Europe experienced the 20th century more than any other place, which gets to the next question. Why is the book so long? I haven't actually counted the pages recently, but I think it's about 900 pages. If the 20th century was where the action is, why does half the book deal with the 19th century? Why does it start in the 1780s? So the answer is not that, well, at some sense it's banal, but in some sense I think it's a little bit more interesting. The answer is that the book was originally supposed to be a history of the 20th century. But after a while, after reading and thinking, I concluded that the 20th century did not make sense in terms of itself. And this point was even truer if you looked at the smaller time units, like the years between the world wars, or the post-World War II years. By imprisoning time in small units, it seemed that I would be failing to project basic comprehension of the region. The difficulty in doing this, in writing the history of the 20th century, and only the 20th century, usually related to the national question. Why was it that right after World War I, a series of new nation states constructed as democracies, nation states as states built on national self-determination, why is it that these states failed to work out? That Slovakia became a problem for Czechoslovakia, or Croatia for Yugoslavia? Why were Hungary or Germany so irredentist? Why was there so little regional cooperation among these democracies? Why did the region slide toward authoritarianism in the 1930s? In a long-term view, one sees that there were a range of challenges facing the new East European states created after World War I, for example, of infrastructure, or monoculture, or illiteracy. But the basic problem was that large and small powers made claims on territory or populations which did not belong to them. Such problems, I concluded, were impossible to explain without going backward in time and probing deeply the history of earlier generations. What I found in the course of writing was that an initially long introduction to the 20th century on the 18th and 19th centuries kept growing from 1 into 2 very long chapters and eventually into 10. This expanding of the book from 1 to 2.5 centuries made it possible to focus on single events, but also broad patterns, perhaps like the way a huge telescope taking in lots of light can reveal celestial bodies otherwise not visible, while at lower magnification, permitting one to probe underlying systems or structures. I made the starting point of the book the 1780s, because from then we can trace the emergence and spread of the national idea in Eastern Europe. Thanks largely to the Austrian monarch Joseph II, who inadvertently did something of great import for all that followed. In the mid-1780s, he attempted to introduce German, the German language, into his realm as the language of administration and education, and by doing so, caused many Hungarians and some Czechs to fear they would become just one more among Central Europe's groups of German speakers. Joseph II made them fear they would disappear from history. Petitions rained upon the court in Vienna from all over Hungary. Inhabitants of one county evoked the fate of the Etruscan city of Veii. Who remembered it now? Like the Etruscans, the Magyars, or the Hungarians, would simply disappear from history. In the words of the Hungarian historian Eva Balázs, Joseph had touched some deep nerve, bringing dormant feelings to the surface, ushering in a new phase of national development. Joseph was insensitive to all pleas, and a generation later, the concern over national disappearance had spawned important political movements, first striving for cultural rights, then gradually for forms of political autonomy. So in response to the impossible question of what exactly Eastern Europe is, or East Central Europe is, I say it is a region of sometimes shifting physical boundaries, of small peoples living between empires, who are characterized by a special fear stoked for generations by their political classes, that they as peoples might disappear from history. I don't entirely exclude the Germans, though Germany is not an East European country in my understanding. Germans belong quite simply because they've lived in the region for generations, and perhaps more importantly, because East Europeans learned what it is to be national from German thinkers. This story, which forms an important part of the first part of the book, of the transfer of German ideas about nationality to Eastern Europe, is basically a story of young men of the early 19th century, mostly from today's Slovakia, overwhelmingly theologians, who instead of bringing people to God, decided to bring their peoples to a full sense of their national identities, thus the book's title. In the years directly after Napoleon's defeat, these aspiring clergymen arrived in the central German city of Jena to study theology. and found themselves in a hotbed of German nationalism. The early German nationalists whom they encountered had felt humiliated by the way French imperial forces of Napoleon had dictated the fortunes of the German lands for almost 2 decades, wiping Germany's weak political form, the Holy Roman Empire, off the map in 1806. That opened the question of where Germany was if it had no state form, and the answer they found was in language. Likewise, the young Slovaks and some Czechs, patriots of the time, portrayed their nations, also lacking states, there was no Slovakia at this time, as united in a common language and culture. Thus, this ethnic nationalism, as it's called, which has characterized the German and East European lands, is not eternal or necessary, but emerged when ethnicity was threatened. More than that, these young theologians, following the German thinker Herder, became convinced that each nation, with its language as its soul, stood in a special relation to God and had a mission to humanity and history. That early generation of patriots then had to work out the tricky question of what language exactly might be the language of the peoples they imagined themselves to belong to, at the time called the Czechoslavs or the South Slavs, with their many differing dialects, in order to give their peoples, the peoples they imagined, a foundation for identity and secure national life. These patriots first wrote dictionaries, because without a dictionary, there was no useful language, and where there was no language, there was no people. The most admired patriot was therefore not a military commander, but a linguist. Right after World War I, about 80 years later, people inspired by these ideas of linguistic and cultural unity of the Czechoslovaks or Czechoslavs or Yugo or South Slavs made new states, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Unfortunately, however, this later generation of patriots did not consult the populations living on the territory of the new states, whether they felt themselves to be Czechoslovaks or Yugoslavs. Which brings us to the 20th century, which historian Eric Hobsbawm called the age of extremes. In the remaining time that I have, I'd like to discuss 3 controversial episodes from the book, 1918, 1933, and 1945. What do we make of the creation and the breakdown of the nation states of Eastern Europe? Was fascism the destiny of the region, as Paul Krugman claimed in an editorial last year? Was communism a simple imposition on an unwilling region? Are East Europeans victims, as a strong governing narrative currently claims? My general approach to the first date, that is 1918, is in keeping with a trend in the current literature, which, rather than celebrate the new nation states as expressions of long suppressed desires for independence, discerns the way they emerged as a major reason for their failure and the failure of the interwar settlement as a whole. The fulfillment of the dreams of nationalists in a region where no borders could be drawn between ethnicities and the lands they claimed produced a combustible material that made the breakdown of democracies in the 1930s possible, perhaps even unavoidable. But I also differ in approach from other historians who have expended energy trying to show how the nation-state formation after World War I might not have happened at all, how this new order was itself contingent. Special attention of colleagues has focused on the Habsburg Monarchy. It might have continued, they argue, and managed to calm interethnic strife and evolved into a democratic federation of states. This point of view makes a lot of sense, especially for critical historians who are understandably eager to contest the easy assumptions of nationalist historiography, according to which the foundation of nation states in 1918 was a necessary and even virtuous thing. Questioning nationalist narratives is not unique to Eastern Europe, as I discovered in my sabbatical. My colleague in Belfast, Fergal McGarry, when talking about the years before the forming of the Irish Free State, also right after World War I, used to stress, still, let us be cautious about the idea that something inevitable was happening. McGarry took special issue with the popular idea that the creation of the Irish Free State was the crowning moment of generations of struggle. What poet W.B. Yeats called a long gestation, the idea that national independence was preceded and necessitated by generations of preparation by nationalists. I think one has to sympathize with the approach of McGarry and many colleagues in East European history. After all, if one says that everything that happened had to happen, what is there to talk about? Counterfactuals are the tool used to open one's mind to virtually every aspect of historical explanation and are indispensable. Still, I think one can go too far. The Habsburg Monarchy was not a gentle multinational colossus that was suddenly sucked into war. Instead, it was a prime agent of causing the war, and it did so not as a gentle state, standing above the nationality conflicts, but as a dysfunctional, ultimately authoritarian entity whose upper tiers were obsessed by nationalism. Nationality conflict did not simply happen to the Habsburg leadership, it governed their dreams. They themselves were as nationalist as any subject peoples, believing that war with the Slavs, as they called it, was inevitable, and that tiny Serbia with its 3 millions was the force that had to be stopped at all costs because it governed the loyalties of its South Slav subjects more effectively than they might. I agree, however, that the creation of the new Eastern Europe was indeed a contingent event, but I see one major contingency: the Sarajevo assassination in June 1914. After that, and the Austro-Hungarian declaration of war, it's hard to imagine any serious alternative to the decline of Russia and the other imperial powers. By 1918, monarchical rule was sapped of legitimacy, and national self-determination seemed the only argument left standing. Once we arrived in 1918, as it actually occurred, it's hard to imagine alternatives to the post-war order and its subsequent breakdown. The other really contingent event besides Sarajevo in making the 20th century and its horrors, in my view, was Berlin, January 1933. Hitler's appointment as Reichschancellor, which, like Gavrilo Princip's act in 1914, one can easily imagine not happening. Before Sarajevo, one could imagine a Europe without fascism. Before January 30th, 1933, one can imagine a Europe without genocide, without the Holocaust. Still, to say that it's hard to conceive of history transpiring very differently, at least for me, does not mean that there's nothing to learn from the history of Eastern Europe after 1918, especially when one sees that US foreign policy, since about 2002, has transpired as if the experiment of 1918-19 in state building and democratization had never happened. In the book, a large part of the explanation for the failure of the democracies created in 1918-1919 focuses indeed on misguided US foreign policy, in particular on the ignorance of the creators of the interwar settlement, in particular Woodrow Wilson, which combined with idealism to produce a fatal outcome. US President Wilson believed that if one simply transplanted democratic institutions from the West, that they would take root and grow, almost as if democracy were the default position of governance once monarchy was abolished. But he and innumerable contemporaries who intervened in history had little sense of the difficulties in making nation states in Eastern Europe. Knowledge on what we now call area studies was very thin on the ground. There was just one expert in Woodrow Wilson's 100-person fact-finding team called the Inquiry in 1918 who knew anything about the multi-ethnic character of Bohemia or Hungary. But for easily comprehensible reasons, he did nothing to warn his president. This was a man named Robert J. Kerner, Harvard PhD in history in 1911, later a professor at UC Berkeley, but also a man born of Czech parents in Chicago, who was an enthusiast for the ideas of T.G. Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia, with whom he had studied in Prague. As far as I can tell, Kerner, the Czech American, did nothing to warn Wilson on the impossibility of creating a Slavic nation state in Bohemia, given the huge population of Germans living there. I found a memo in the UC Berkeley library in which Kerner informed his superiors that the nationhood of Czechoslovakia, or Yugoslavia, was a scientific fact. And therefore, the rights of Czechoslovaks and Yugoslavs was a natural and absolute right. Sailing to Europe in December of 1918, Wilson was said to have exclaimed suddenly when discovering that there were 2 million Germans living in Bohemia, "Why, Masaryk never told me about that." But neither had later UC Berkeley professor Kerner. This scientifically clothed naivete of Americans was matched, of course, by a heavy dose of self-righteousness among Czech elites who felt that Bohemia was in some essential way their ethnic property. This self-righteousness combined with greed among Czech but also Romanian elites who took every square meter they could from the defeated Hungary, including lots of land right along the new borders with concentrated Magyar populations. So I argue in the book that interwar Hungarian and German irredentism, which were so destabilizing in the 1930s, would have been much weaker without the blithe self-righteousness of US foreign policy as well as without the hypocrisy and vindictiveness in establishing the post-war boundaries of the losers. What about World War II? The major turning point leading to the outbreak of war in Europe, as I've suggested, was the coming to power of Hitler. This was not predetermined, but was the result of machinations among right-wing German elites. From January 1933, the story is pretty well known of Hitler's eliminating rivals, of his taking advantage of Western pacifism, duplicity, and sore conscience. The only person who seems to have played out of script was Winston Churchill in 1940, when he engineered unlikely resistance to Hitler among British elites. But Churchill's was not the only note of defiance. In contrast to governing narratives, I portray Eastern Europe not as a region somehow congenitally predisposed to fascism. In fact, fascism in East Central Europe was a marginal force, gaining mass popularity only in two places, Romania and Hungary, and coming to power nowhere on its own. A lot of the explanation is unromantic. Fascism was weak among Czechs, Serbs, or Poles because it was associated with the national enemy. And fascism was crushed in Romania and Hungary due not to democratic tradition, but to the strength of authoritarian rule. In the book, I therefore speak of East European anti-fascism, and I also highlight moments of defiance of the small states against the emergent Nazi power in 1939 and 1941, when Polish and then Serb elites, supported by broad swaths of their populations, defied Hitler and the plans he had for Poland and Yugoslavia to become Germany's allies. Specialists know, but non-specialists are often surprised to learn that in early 1939, the German government courted Poland for an alliance that would be directed against the USSR. The Polish government said no. Then Poland essentially absorbed the Nazi onslaught alone in the late summer of 1939, an onslaught that indeed brought the UK and France into war and made it a kind of war that Hitler had not intended. In another little-known story, which I highlight in the book, in March 1941, Serb military officers in Belgrade staged a coup against their own government's recent accession to a pact with Nazi Germany. This coup then brought the German army into Yugoslavia. This by no means had been the plan of the German elite. The Serb Defiance arguably directed the war in ways Hitler had not intended and helped lead to his defeat, because the attack on Yugoslavia was delayed and the Nazi assault on the Soviet Union took place later than it was supposed to. One could easily romanticize or heroize these stories, and of course there were many heroes. But the long-term perspective makes clear that these two acts of defiance made a lot of sense in terms of the stories that people told about the nation to each other, going back generations, of what I call insurrectionary nationalism, meaning that in Poland and Serbia, compromise in matters of national sovereignty was considered to be unacceptable. So now comes the tricky part. As is well known, Serbia and Poland were quickly subdued, indeed crushed. Were these and other societies simply victims? This has become part of an official narrative, in the Polish case supported by law. My answer would be simply that research shows.
All right, welcome back, sir.
So I think I was just coming to my conclusion. Is that where it broke off more or less?
You tell us.
Okay, I don't know what my last words were. I was talking about Władysław Frasyniuk and his thoughts about the current Polish prime minister as being himself a product of communism, although he criticizes communism as being something foreign. That was my final thought. Where did you hear me break off?
Christian, as I understand it, we should go back a little bit further. Yeah, we were still on the World War II example.
Really? Okay. Did I talk about communism? Was I talking about communism yet? No. Okay. Well, just to conclude, my argument about World War II is that the general assertion that East Europeans were victims cannot be upheld. Some East Europeans were collaborators. That is, for example, Poles were collaborators. Some were opponents. More were opponents. But the general picture that one has, I think, of World War II is that people above all tried to survive. And then I was moving into the post-World War II period. So you heard nothing about that, is that correct? Communism, okay. So regarding the post-World War II period, I argue in the book that East Europe, on the one hand, can be portrayed as a victim of communism. There were very few East Europeans before the war who would have hoped for or invited Soviet-style rule. So Soviet-style rule was a violent imposition upon the region at the cost of tens of thousands of dead, as well as populations of deportees and political prisoners that ran into hundreds of thousands, if not millions. But at the same time, and this is something I discovered in my first book, the Soviets themselves were very thin on the ground in Eastern Europe, and guidelines for imposing the new system were imprecise. Therefore, it fell to East Europeans themselves to implement the new system. Therefore, we find not just thousands, but hundreds of thousands and millions of accomplices, many not willing at first, but very effective self-Sovietizers who made Warsaw or Prague resemble Moscow by 1955. And from the late 1950s produced a range of national communist regimes, Kadar to Gierek to Ceausescu. After it was all over, after the revolutions of 1989, many of us thought communism would simply be shaken off as a foreign system. But here we are, all these years later, 31 years later, discovering that communism has gone deeply into East Europe's psyche. There was a Polish Catholic philosopher who was actually active when I was a student in Krakow in the early 1980s, Józef Tischner. He coined the term Homo Sovieticus, a certain type of personality that became a mass phenomenon, not willing to take responsibility for one's own deeds, not able to think independently, always full of demands, always ready to blame others, sickly suspicious, consumed by unhappiness. Above all, Homo Sovieticus is certain that communism was something he or she did not participate in. What I've found remarkable and revealing is that dissidents, indeed those who devoted their energies to opposing communism, people like Václav Havel, Adam Michnik, George Conrad, or Roland Jahn, all emphasized that to varying degrees, everyone was involved in the system, part of it, including themselves. Today's populists, right-wing populists throughout the region claim otherwise. They say that there was us and there was them, the virtuous nation versus the Soviet lackey. And they use this argument to reinforce their own power, but they too are creations of that old system. In a recent interview, the solidarity activist Władysław Frasyniuk said that Poland's current premier, Morawiecki, the man who undoes liberal separation of powers because he says Polish judges are holdovers from communist days, he himself is a creation of communist times. To quote Frasyniuk, Morawiecki completed communist schools, studied at a University of People's Poland, was taught by communists and then post-communists. In other words, he is a communist bastard. And his children and grandchildren will be post-communist bastards. We are a generation, concluded Frasyniuk, we are a generation educated and shaped by the former system, a fact that has consequences. We now know that it is easier to win the freedom of borders than to become free human beings. So with that, I concluded my remarks and wanted to move on to 5 concluding thoughts before opening to questions. And there are variations on the theme of ethnic nationalism, something that won't surprise you. The first is that East Europe, in my view, is a distinct region with identifiable features. Above all, this extraordinary sensitivity about history, deeply shared belief that the world of conventions and tastes and cultures is deeply contingent and everything, including nations, come and go. To say that East European nationalism has a primarily ethnic dimension, however, is not to deny that places where nationalism is understood as being civic or political, like in the US or the UK, don't also have the presence of ethnic nationalism. There was a book in the early 90s by Michael Ignatieff called Blood and Belonging, in which Ignatieff questioned whether British nationalism was as multicultural and cosmopolitan as it is often cracked up to be. There is within British nationalism also another species, which Ignatieff called Englishness, an antagonistically defined creed of an Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation locked in battle with continental Europe, the papacy, and the Catholic Irish. The tendencies in a given nationalism toward political and civic or cultural and ethnic can shift over time. So if English nationalism has been on the rise and become much more ethnic since the early 1990s than Ignatieff could have imagined, in Germany, nationalism has become more civic, especially in the last decade, in ways that I think would have surprised people 20 years ago. The English case shows that the fear of ethnicity under siege and perhaps disappearing is not unique. Such a fear stood behind support in North English small towns for Brexit, for example. Northern Ireland is an even more pronounced case of a society behaving in terms that East Europeans understand, especially among so-called loyalists, mostly Protestants who desperately fear a loss of identity. When he visited Northern Ireland in the early 1990s, Ignatieff encountered a man living close to the border of the Irish Republic, but in the north, named Dick Sterrett. Sterrett chastised the English, right? The loyalists are better English than the English themselves. He chastised the English across the Irish Sea for no longer singing God Save the Queen in their movie houses. They don't seem to have any story to tell, any song to sing, he said. They don't seem to know who they are. This man posed an important question. Does not every community that is to have any coherence need a common song to sing? Nations are imagined communities, but more basically, if they are to succeed, they are collectivities in which people tell each other a common story about who they are. Now, when I say such words, I sound conservative, and that fact signals a huge problem for liberals, the inability to speak about ethnic identity as if it were not something exotic and irrational. This inability has had huge cost to the left and center left for generations, usually going under the name populism. In the book, I date populism's challenge in East and Central Europe to the 1880s. Like today, it was a mix, left and right, and began as a generational revolt of young people in the party, young liberals against old liberals in the Viennese establishment. The basic force behind the generational revolt was the perception that the older generation had lost touch and did not give a damn about the common people. People understood in both the social and ethnic senses. The liberal establishment in the faraway capital had simply gone to sleep. Over the decades, populists have overtaken liberals on the left, and in the US, conservatives on the right. Third point, briefly, fascism, if one is interested in my view, was an extreme form of right-wing populism, consisting of a violent assertion of supposed rights of the nation, understood again in this dual sense, ethnically and socially. Fascism rose to mass movements in 4 places in interwar Europe: Germany, Italy, Romania, and Hungary. What all these cases had in common were arguments by populists precisely of extreme neglect, indeed contempt by elites in the faraway cities for common people. Now fascism has perhaps faded, but the argument that elites are contemptuous of the ethnic and social nation have not. It's heard in Hungary and Poland, but as we know, it's also heard in Northern England, towns of France and Northern Italy, and some important swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. Fourth point, there's an interesting paradox at work here. On the one hand, the fact that nations can indeed disappear, as one sees when one looks at thousands of years of history, and the undoubted fact that they were and are indeed contingent, that is, nations. But on the other, that from the 1780s, the fact that this knowledge has translated into fear and spawned mass movements up and down the East European region, giving rise to what seems precisely the opposite of a contingent event, namely a pattern. Right, you see this pattern, that's what gives the book coherence, up and down the space between the Russian and German lands. So that if nations are imagined communities, humans don't imagine them just as they choose. The ultimate failures of the imagined communities of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia are evidence of that. And if nations are daily plebiscites, the choice on the ballot has generally just been one. And those who might have opted for something called national indifference, for saying, I don't give a damn about the nation, discovered that this choice was a combination of irrelevance and meaninglessness. Point 5, still, it has to be emphasized that this fear that a language and culture may disappear is usually not mass consciousness. Average people are mostly not concerned about such things in Eastern Europe or elsewhere on an everyday basis. And in the 1780s, the average Hungarian or Czech speakers were not worried about Joseph II and his language policies. The people who really cared about nationalism were the politicized, people involved in public affairs. Political preachers and prophets, people who spend their lives making arguments and browbeating the skeptical. As I mentioned, the heroes of the national movements at first were theologians of one sort or another, literally preachers. Ireland, I think, again, is very instructive. Precisely at the point zealots were building up the national movement in Ireland in the late 19th century, thousands of average people were ceasing to speak the Irish language with their children. Why? Because it had no practical benefit. And today, maintaining the Irish language is not a huge concern for the average person, north or south. Still, that language remains a central and crucial element of national identity that cannot be ignored in the political realm. It acts as a kind of ultimate currency in the corridors of power. Until earlier this year, the local legislature in Northern Ireland, the Stormont, had been adjourned for 3 years, partly over dispute about the use of Irish, a language very few people speak, and even those who can speak it hardly use it with other people who can speak it. They prefer to speak English because it's more useful for them. The lesson, however, is no Irish politician can stand against the Irish language. What does this remind you of? It reminded me, when thinking about these things in current terms, of the predicament, largely self-inflicted, arguably, of today's Republicans in the US, and the inability of any of them to speak some obvious truths. It's as though a higher logic had taken over. No one can stand up to Donald Trump on the right because he has cornered the market on the language of ethnic nationalism. But that's not the final word. Nationalism, after all, was originally much more a left of center than right of center phenomenon. And its causes for liberation, for rights, against fascism in interwar Poland or Serbia, for democracy at many points, are by no means conservative. So perhaps when I said that there seems only one choice of the nation as daily plebiscite, I was incorrect. Politics is or should be a frequent plebiscite about what kind of nation one wants to celebrate. Does one favor a nationalism that relies not upon fear, but upon inspiration, that is curious about other nations rather than hostile to them, that relies upon culture as a way to unite rather than divide, that endeavors to break down walls rather than build them? If there is no clear distinction between ethnic and civic nationalism, the political left should by no means give up the field of ethnic nationalism to the right. Why should the left not be concerned about culture, about ethnicity, about poetry, about songs, symbols, the deep and more proximate common stories that hold people together? If the left insists on treating nationhood as a purely imagined and mostly unfortunate fiction, it will continue to be reminded that for most people who cast ballots, nationhood is a fact of some kind, and their ballots will go increasingly right of center. So that was the conclusion of my conclusions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, John. So now we're going to open this up for questions. Very simply, you use the chat function on the bottom of your screen on Zoom. You will get into a queue. We will call on you. You can also email the AHA at rweatley@historians.org if you are on Facebook as well. Just one observation in passing, it's actually 800 pages of text and 138 pages of notes. So this is a long and very rich book, and you were able to touch upon only a very, very small number of stories in the pages here. I want to ask a question just to get us going that kind of builds on both the conclusion of the book, but also the conclusion of your talk. And in the book, you offer the following summation at the end. For over 2 centuries, you say, ethnic nationalism in Eastern Europe has acted as a kind of ideology of unrivaled force, transforming and subverting other kinds of politics. But you also make the point that nationalists, quote, were not representative. No one had elected them to promote their causes. And to do so, they used, quote, all of the means at their disposal, from national print media, bureaucracies of nation states, and imperial schools, to inculcate in the masses a new sense of belonging that was broad, but also narrow and exclusive, uniting the disparate populations and instructing them about the aliens in their midst. This task of spreading national consciousness, you say, among often indifferent populations, absorbed the energies of generations and was completed only after World War II, and no other force could compete with it for mobilizing human energies. So in these quotes that I've woven together, you both make it very clear that, as you did in the talk, that for many ordinary Eastern Europeans, nationalism or ethno-nationalism was not necessarily first and foremost on their minds, and that intellectuals, elites, and political activists worked very, very hard using culture, using media, using all sorts of tools at their disposal to drive home the message that nationalism is important, and that nationalism ultimately took root by the end of the Second World War. Do I have that right? And why the indifference on so many people's parts up to this point in time? And does this mean that we've reached a point of no return where nationalism will be with us always?
Well, I don't know if indifference is the exact right word. Maybe lack of knowledge, ignorance in the neutral sense of the word, not in a negative sense. It's that people before literacy had a sense of their community being the local village, and they simply didn't have the wherewithal to imagine a larger community, to know about a larger community. So usually these communities were not so much indifferent as unaware of the possibility of there being a larger community to which they might owe allegiance. And so really the nationalization is this breakthrough in which populations become literate, and then they become involved in knowledge about these stories, these national stories that are, then of course it's very important who gets to write the national histories, right? And so the Czech national movement, which is the paradigmatic one, insisted upon getting control of elementary schools and of inculcating a certain kind of understanding of the past in people. And it was something, it has to be said, that caught on very quickly. That for people, especially young people, get politicized more easily than older people. They become idealists. They become enthusiasts of certain ideas, and it became possible to actually make people enthusiastic about the national idea very quickly, within a few generations. There's also a practical aspect to becoming national. That is that people found that it was easier to do business. Even to do science, let us say, to do scholarship, to do all kinds of practical things with people who understood your own idiom immediately, to do theater, to do humor. I mean, virtually all of these important aspects of what we call culture and science are practically done more easily in your own quote unquote native idiom. So there was a natural attractiveness to this kind of nationalism. But I want to get to something that you made me think of that I don't talk much about in the book, but I think is extremely powerful, which is that the ultimate resort of nationalists in spreading the idea was not simply to fear this idea that our nation may disappear. It was to shame. Right? And it reminds me that the nationalist recruiting posters in Britain during World War I, in which people were made to fear that they were being unmanly toward their family, right, toward their children and toward their wives, toward their families, and that was the reason to go off to war. And so young Czechs would be told if they were inadequate in the national question, say in the 1890s, not concerned about it, they would be told that they were betraying not just the nation but their own families, right? So there's a way in which the nationalist narrative managed to merge concerns, or even the language, the imaginary, of family and nation in a way that made it very difficult for people to stand against it. So that, as I show in the book, and I'm not the first person to show this, even the Marxist social democrats in the Czech lands found they had no other option but to adopt concerns of the national movement. One didn't think about nationalism all the time, but on the other hand, one didn't want to risk being portrayed as unnational or anti-national. That was intolerable. And because I think in politics, the ultimate recourse, and we're seeing this in our own country, right? The ultimate recourse to a discourse of shame is an extremely powerful one. And if you can shame a political opponent in some ways, that's the most effective means of pushing that political opponent into a corner. So I think nationalism ultimately operated with this imaginary that combined ideas of nation with ideas of family in a way that nobody could contest.
Thank you. We have a number of hands that are raised in my queue, and I am going to call on Darius Stola. So if you could unmute yourself, I would appreciate it.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, John. How are you?
Hi, Darius.
From Warsaw. I'm pretty sure I will read your book. I haven't read it yet. I have two questions. One general, one specific. Do I understand correctly that you claim that the history of nationalisms in Eastern Europe is the most important process from 1780s to the present? And if so, what's the second one? What's the second or third most important process in this history that you have presented? And more specific, referring to your last comment about the potential for political mobilization of the young people. Do you think it was just a coincidence that the spread of nationalism coincided with the demographic explosion in the late 19th, early 20th century, when the proportion of young people in the populations in Eastern Europe was the highest in history? Was it a coincidence, or was it a factor in the spread of modern nationalism? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I don't say, thank you for the questions. I don't say precisely that the history of the growth of national consciousness was the most important process. I don't know if I even describe it as a process, but I do say that if one wants to understand what holds together the common sense of identity of peoples in the regions, one has to look at the growth of the national idea and its spread through institutions. And I'm not, you know, I don't know that I would then want to rank that. I don't know that there are processes that one can rank as in a list, but, you know, processes that coincide are, one would be the one you've just pointed to in your second question, the demographic explosion, also the gradual modernization that took place in Eastern Europe, making it possible for there to be a mass politics, for there to be induction into mass armies, for there to be literacy. All of these things coincide and strengthen nationalism. In some ways, the processes, if that's the right word, are intertwined. So I would say it's a fundamental process that one witnesses everywhere. Answer to the first question, but it is intertwined with other processes, primarily that of basic modernization, permitting this national message to spread and itself to become modern, right? And that's of course done in complex ways that are that various authors have tried to explain. The demographic explosion indeed is important. I don't know that I would point to it as being as important as other things. I mean, obviously nationalism grows in France in the late 19th century, but the French population growth more or less freezes after about the 1860s. So I don't know that that's as fundamental as these other processes of modernization that I've pointed to. But yes, so in any case, I'm not somebody who would claim that nationalism is the story that stands far above others. I would simply say it's a fundamental current that runs through the histories of these societies that help lend a certain the societies a certain kind of self-understanding that is distinct, but not absolutely different from every other place on earth. And that is why I spent time talking about the North Irish case, but also the English case.
Thank you. I am now going to call on Alice Freefeld. If you would unmute yourself, we can take your question.
Hi, John.
Hi, are you in Florida?
No, I'm not. I want to be, but I'm afraid to go back. I'm in DC. I have a question. First of all, thank you for the book. It's really necessary and needed right now. We need to keep revisiting this topic. And in your introduction, I just quote you back for a second. When nationally indifferent people become political, they became national. And I thought that summed up the yeast of public participation in society in the 19th century better than I ever did in crowd politics. But I wonder about indifference. Is indifference benign? You mentioned in your talk just now, you said history knocking at the door, it's a participant in the family. Is that benign? Is somebody knocking on your door reminding you of the history? Are they intruders? And that brings me to fascism. You never, in this talk, you didn't talk about resentment or defeat as a reason for turning to fascism. You know, Hungary and Romania think of themselves as losers after and whether and how much that plays into it. I feel very, I'm asking you rather than stating it, because I used to make this argument that between nationalism and patriotism, America being patriotic because it's optimistic, but nationalism being about defeat, and it's always martyrology. But Make America Great Again is a martyrology too, so, or resentment also. So I'll turn it back to you.
Yes, thank you. The history that I was talking to, and I think the way that it's recalled in memoirs, they're usually about the 20th century, is not a benign force. It's usually a destructive force. It doesn't, in retrospect, even the great utopian projects that people at the time thought were very positive, in retrospect are recalled as being devastating, right? Like Stalinism, for example. For the tens of thousands who built Stalinism, it was thought to be a case of history working its miracles, its wonders, right? So perhaps maybe it's a fascinating question. Is it benign? I would say, generally speaking, when you're forced to write about the history knocking at the door, it is something. It's an intruder you would rather not have knock at the door. I would say that. I mean, I don't know if I would absolutely stand by that, but it's unfortunate. You know, over the course of recent generations, at least in Eastern Europe, one can't think of. You think of 1989, you think of all the hope and the promise that was associated with 1989. I think now people are very skeptical of that, right? Of the idea that, I remember in 1989 we had a conference inviting scholars from Europe to Harvard, actually, ironically, to talk about the 30th anniversary of the creation. It was the 40th anniversary of the creation of the Federal Republic, and it so happened that the GDR was falling apart in those very days. And Charles Mayer said, you know, sometimes we hear the sounds of history, but sometimes we just hear a rush of noise and can't make out what history is. The difference between Geräusche der Geschichte and das Rauschen der Geschichte. I think he was right. It was, in some ways, there's a Rauschen of history, and it's very difficult to figure out, you know, what is benign and what is malignant. Fascism, you know, the radical right in Romania and Hungary, I think they're very much, especially in Hungary, were imprinted by the sense of defeat and betrayal, and it was crucial to the narratives they told in the 1930s and 1940s, and I think it was almost inescapable. This is, you know, when I was talking to Eric earlier about the power of the national argument, it really was done in that time in terms of shame. Could anybody not care about Trianon, even today? Right, this is over 100 years later. To go to, you know, to go to Budapest and say that you don't care. I mean, as a Hungarian, you don't care about Trianon, or you think it was just, or you think it's a non-issue. It's a very difficult thing to say. So that, you know, I don't know. I think that these small countries, they have more of these things in their past than Americans perhaps understand, because America has never been shocked in that way. America is of a size that it can absorb a lot of blows, a lot of defeats, a lot of unfortunate decisions, a lot of very bad policy can be absorbed because of the size and wealth of this country. Whereas in a place like Hungary or Romania, if you get 2/3 of your territory taken away, that's the kind of blow that's very difficult it's impossible to ignore. So perhaps to bring the two questions together, I think, you know, history has an influence on these small countries that is probably unimaginable. I think for people living in the West, but maybe has become more imaginable in the last 10 years. Thanks, it's a very intriguing question.
And I'm now calling on Hugh Agnew, if you would unmute yourself. Let's try it again. Hugh, you're there.
I think I am unmuted now.
Yes, you are.
Thank you for the book, John. It's a wonderful accomplishment, and your talk was fascinating, even with the interruption. I guess my question is more process-oriented than content-oriented. Perhaps only someone who has never tried it themselves would think 800 pages was a distillation. And I wanted to ask you, what was the hardest part about writing a book like this?
The hardest part? Well, you know, in some sense, it was difficult when I began thinking further back in time, into your time, actually, Hugh. You know, Hugh is a great specialist of Central European history, 18th, 19th centuries. When I began moving backward and really trying to figure out what it was that supported the events of the 20th century, that it became difficult. I'd been teaching the 20th century for years, and in some sense that was relatively easy to write. And I'd been trained by a lot of outstanding political scientists and the work of outstanding political scientists like Joseph Rothschild, Andrew Janos at Berkeley. But it's only, you know, to get back to, you know, Daresh's question about process that might stand next to the question of nationalization. You know, it's when I began asking that question of myself, what is it that is the important background history to the 20th century? You know, is it the modernization? Is it the demographic growth of the 19th century? Is it in Poland, is it the mobilization around insurrections? Is it the development of various kinds of national discourses? Trying to figure out, out of a welter of detail, how to distill, as you say, into 10 chapters what's important about the 18th and 19th centuries. That was, I think, the greatest challenge. It was, in other words, trying to figure out what in the deeper past was necessary for understanding the more proximate past. That would be my answer. And one of the things I drew upon, of course, was your own excellent work on the Bohemian national movement.
And I'm now calling on Elaine Brown. If you could unmute. There we go.
I have a simple question. As the nationalism waxes and wanes, is there a correlation with that and anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so it depends a bit on the place, but generally speaking, I would say there's a strong correlation, stronger in some places than others, stronger in Romania, and Romania in particular is a place that I found that to be Romanian national was to imagine Romanianness as being non-Jewish. And that was an absolute kind of discourse, if you will, extending from the 1850s far forward. In Poland also, there's a very strong, but not exclusive in the same way, anti-Semitism associated with nationalism on the right. In Poland, there's a strong, in my view, maybe I idealize, but in the center left, associated with the socialist movement, I think there's a nationalism that is indeed more civic and open to Jews, open to imagining Jews as Poles. The Czech lands, there's also on the right, on the far right, as nationalism grew, and in the late 19th century, a strong tendency to anti-Semitism, not as important an element as in other nationalisms. Hungary was actually quite remarkable because the Hungarian national movement was open to Jews entering the Hungarian nation until 1918, until the end of World War I, because many Jews became great Hungarian patriots and poets and writers and officials and scientists, etc. Jews played a very important part in the Hungarian national movement. But the national movement found them useful because they strengthened the national movement against other groups. And that changed then after World War I. So I guess my bottom line, since the time is short, is that the general answer would be yes, that the presence of anti-Semitism strengthens as nationalism strengthens, but it does so in different ways and it's not exclusive. And if you want to find alternatives, you look center-left, generally speaking.
Thank you. Piotr Kosicki, we are now activating you. If you would, there you go. Piotr.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi, Eric. Hi, John. It's good to see you. Thanks for the book and thanks for the presentation. I just got my copy, so the questions come slightly from a place of ignorance, but I wanted to ask you two things. The first, to what extent when writing a history of Eastern Europe do you feel it's important to write about places that are outside Eastern Europe? And obviously, I think a lot about France, but you mentioned Northern Ireland, you mentioned England. I'm just curious more generally, what you would think about, is there a fluidity between Western and Eastern Europe that requires bring the West in or not. And then the second has to do with the notion of empire, which I think plays a bigger role just from reading the introduction quickly in the book, but in understanding the concept of nations and nationalism as you were going through them in the talk, I'm curious, empire, does it work? Does it help us in connecting the 19th and 20th centuries? Or is it a bit of a red herring, given your thinking about nationalism? Thank you.
Excellent. Places outside Eastern Europe, I tend to keep focus on this sense of nationalization and the development of the national idea into nation states and their histories. That's basically the narrative sweep of the book. So I talk about non-East European places to the extent that they are important for that focus. So at the intellectual history level, it tends to be German philosophy that I talk. If I go outside the region, and obviously one has to say a lot about what's happening, a fair amount about what's happening in the Soviet Union, what's happening in Vienna, if you consider Vienna to be outside of Eastern Europe. But I don't go much to France. Don't go much to Great Britain. I don't really, in this book at least, in this the way that it's conceived, don't say much about it. But there's room to do so, right? I mean, I think now that I've looking at other things, I'm interested in populism, democratization, and I think one could very easily bring the democratization and populism studies of these phenomena into conversation, not just with West European cases, but with Latin America. In recent days, I've been in conversation with a colleague who studies populism in Latin America, and I think it's very fruitful to think of of these regions in comparison. But I would simply insist that it be very clear what the reason is that one is going beyond the East European region. But yes, indeed, one learns a lot by looking beyond. And I was amazed to land in Belfast and find I was back in Warsaw in some ways, right? Or I was back in Prague. That I think that I understood a lot by having been in places that are in some ways similar. Empire, empire is not a key concept for me in the book. I don't view the Habsburgs as representing an empire in the way that, say, the British Empire or the French Empire, these massive colonial empires, or the Russian Empire or the German Empire in the 19th century. It was more a defensive construct. And then after World War I, if one has imperial places, it's Nazi Germany, it's the Soviet Empire. It's for me not a crucial concept. I'll just say that very briefly, but one could say much more about that as well.
Thank you. James Hirschberg. Jim, you are now free to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Eric. Hi, Christian, and hi, John. Congratulations on the book. It's good to see you. Of course, I'm obsessed with the Cold War, so it will take some work to go back as far as you did. But your talk and your book prompts the following question, which is looking at the relative strengths of nationalism and communism in East Central Europe after World War II. Have you at all changed your view of 1956? In particular, this came up in a recent chat, the counterfactual, had Khrushchev and the Soviets not invaded Hungary in November, would you have seen a dynamic of 1989 in 1956-57?
Thank you. I don't know about the dynamic of 1989, but you would have seen maybe a dynamic more of like Yugoslavia, right? That is the creation of an independent kind of socialism that stood apart from the Soviet model. It's very hard to imagine that happening. I don't know. I think that it's the domino effect, but for the Soviet Union, right? So that if Hungary had fallen, and then if there were a sense at that point that Poland was going as well, there would have been an intervention. What about there are hundreds of thousands of troops in East Germany? What about East Germany in 1956? Could the Soviet Union could it have let East Germany go? I don't think Khrushchev was. Well, we know, right? I think we have evidence that Khrushchev was not willing to let that happen. And I think that's why they chose to intervene in Hungary, because they thought it was relatively easier than intervening in Poland. I mean, I don't know if we have actual archival evidence about this, but I'm gathering that Hungary was meant to send a clear sign to Poland that this is the potential of going too far in the direction of reform communism, right? the problem with 1956, in my view, has always been the one that, that Zbigniew Brzezinski points to in his book from the late 1950s, which is that the Polish Communist Party did not take advantage of the free spaces that were open to it in the late 1950s, and the Hungarians did. Right? I mean, Kadar's communism, the great irony of 1956 is that the country that was offered space and freedom went in the direction of uniformity and greater ideological indoctrination. Poland, with some exceptions, and the country that was crushed and whose revolutionaries were executed was the country that went in the direction of moderation. So that's always struck me as being strange about 1956. But I don't think 1989 would have been the consequence had there not been a Hungarian intervention. There would have been an intervention somewhere else. Would be my thought, but subjective opinion.
And now, Ross Johnson, you are free to unmute.
There you go. Thank you very much. I look forward to the book. Two questions. You're discussing what's commonly called the new nationalisms in Central and Eastern Europe after 1848. The creation in the first instance of intellectuals. Do you see that as any different from the rise of the old nationalisms in old Europe, Germany, France, Italy, and so on? The second question is the interwar period and the anomalies of two multinational states, which Wilson supported, but there were indigenous support for both Czechoslovakia and the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes on the ground, and yet they both fell apart, and arguably we ended up with two real fascist states, Slovakia and the so-called independent state of Croatia. So how do you see those anomalies of those two multinational states, and would you accept this characterization of fascism for Croatia and Slovakia?
Wait, could you explain the question behind the second question?
Yes, indeed. I take it. You made a point that some of the damage in the interwar period was due to the American approach and Woodrow Wilson's approach, fostering a whole bunch of new national ethnic national states, and yet we had two anomalies. We had two multinational states. Why did Wilson go along with that? And the consequence of when they broke up, and was that fascism?
Okay, I'll start from the back. Yeah, I think one can describe Ustaša regime as fascist, and certainly elements of the Slovak regime as fascist. I think that's pretty clear. Yeah, I mean it's not precisely the same as Nazi Germany, but they did in effect represent extreme right-wing nationalist movements. I think that and these two movements grew out of the interwar states, right? Although the Ustaša was much weaker in Croatia than the Tiso movement was in Slovakia, and that Tiso himself Father Hlinka, predecessor to Tiso, went along with the creation of Czechoslovakia because he believed that the Czechs were the brothers of the Slovaks, and discovered by the fall of 1919 that in fact they weren't. And thereafter you have a very strong Slovak independence movement. I think Wilson simply didn't understand that he was creating two multinational states. If you look at the papers of his advisors, Kerner, and didn't actually meet in person, but the person supplying information, there was no sense whatsoever that Czechoslovakia was importantly multinational. The Germans didn't count, and the Czechs and Slovaks were projected as being brother peoples. And the Yugoslavs, as Kerner wrote, he said, the Yugoslavs are a scientific fact, right? So the fact that the people shared language, essentially, one South Slavic language across such a huge space, convinced Kerner that they shared at the heart of nationalism in a way. So here you see basically a kind of stereotype about national identity and language masquerading as science. I think Wilson didn't know that these were two multinational states. As far as the question about 1848 and the new nationalism versus the old nationalism, I actually think that the so Western Europe, I think that the nationalism there is also a relatively recent phenomenon. It's strong 18th century, certainly in the German lands, and at the origin point usually pointed to Britain is not as important, but France. The French Enlightenment and ideas of what the French nation are, those things themselves take off in a very important and strong way in the late 18th century. So I think Ross, this is really the next generation. They're not that far apart in time, and so you can see the movement of the national idea across the European continent within about 2 generations. So it is a European story in that sense, and I think it's important to point that out.
And I'm now calling on Katrin Schultheis. You should be free to unmute.
Am I there?
You are.
Hi, John. So I haven't read your book, but Eric has. My question for you has to do with the 19th century, and you attribute the rise of ideas about nationalism to imports from the West, from Germany in particular. But what about the East? So I was wondering what the role in the 19th century, not when you get the Soviet Union, but what was the role of Russia in all of this? Because it seems like one way that Eastern Europe has classically been identified is that region of the continent caught between Russia, which is part of Eastern Europe, and the West. So could you talk a little bit about the role of Russia in this formation of an East European nationalism?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's important. I don't dwell enough upon it in the book, probably. One way in which, in terms of intellectual history, the Russian case is extremely important is in so-called Pan-Slavism, which was an ideology that was supported by Tsarist regimes in the early and mid-19th century, suggesting that there was a community of Slavic peoples, including the Czechs and the Russians and the Poles, which was incredibly influential in Prague after 1848. In fact, there was a Slavic Congress in which Russians took part. But I mean, the general sense, I think, in historiography is that was a relatively superficial phenomenon, that there wasn't much behind it in terms of actual historical community, that when Czech intellectuals actually went to Moscow, they didn't find much that they wanted to bring back as supporting their own causes. And of course, in the Polish case, the nation is defined against Russia, right? So that in a sense, and then there's almost there's almost an obsession with Russia as being an antipode to everything Poland is. So if you want to call that Russian influence, it was extremely strong, and also among the Ukrainian elite trying to separate itself from Russia in the late 19th century. So there's a reaction against Russia. Further south, there's a strong sense of community, of course, of Orthodox peoples, Serbia, Romania, Greece, Bulgaria, right? And the Russian influence there again is strong, but it's not so much, I think, ideational, but there it's more geostrategic, the sending of soldiers, of troops, the fighting of battles, right, in the 1870s, Russia supposedly standing up for the Christian peoples of that region. But again, I think it's very important for Serbs, and Serb national movement, Bulgarian national movement, to define themselves against Russia as well. So there's always a kind of a tension between attraction and fascination, and a sense of the need to define oneself against Russia. The same is true, by the way, between Bulgaria and Greece in the early 19th century. But I would stop there. I don't think that in terms of there's nothing like Herder coming out of Russia, right? There's no thinker quite like that. And of course, the other important thinker for East European nationalism, I'll stop with this, is Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was famously not Russian, right? He obviously had a great impact upon Russian history. But Lenin, I don't know that Lenin had a very deep, or Stalin wrote a book about the nationality question. I don't think that they left very deep traces in the East European case. But it's a very good question, one that one could probably write a companion volume about this very issue.
Thank you. James Sheehan, you can now unmute. We see your name. We need you to,
Yes,
there we go.
I've succeeded in doing that. Hello, John. Greetings from the other side of town. There is in your book, as in all great books, an interplay between contingency and determinism. And one of the places where the determinism really seems to take hold is your fascinating chapter on the Ausgleich of 1867, where you essentially argue that once that's done, the fate of the Habsburg monarchy is sealed. I wonder if you could say a little more about that and use that opportunity maybe to compare your views to Peter Judson, who has also recently published a big and important book on that particular subject.
Yes, well, thank you. Thinking about determination and contingency, I was thinking before the talk actually more about the 1914 issue. You know, if there hadn't been for that shot fired at Sarajevo, could the Habsburg Empire have somehow managed to gradually evolve into something different and better and able to cope with the demands of mass politics and nationalism in particular? And the thing is, 1914, we don't see any signs of that. I think, you know, Peter, as I recall, his book is very sophisticated in these matters. I think he may be he's less deterministic than I am. More willing to see these constructs in the terms of their time. I have the same response to 1867 that I do to 1914, which is that on the one hand, I think that it's incredibly contingent, especially upon the work of high elites, the Empress in particular, and her advocacy for the Hungarian cause, and the series of ministers that are called in the early 1860s, the Lost War. I mean, there are a number of these things that you can point to that make 1867 seem highly contingent, right? I mean, dependent upon this turning point, that turning point, and that turning point. But then when you look at the broader situation of the Habsburg Empire at the time, the possibility of indeed creating a federal unit for Bohemia, or some kind of federal representation for the Italian lands, for the Polish lands and the like, I think that there were just too many forces from within the empire that opposed that kind of solution. I think without the solution, there would have been a kind of protracted stalemate. I think dissolution is too strong a word. I don't know what would have succeeded it. But again, it's similar to 1914. So Jim, I guess I'm caught in being happy that history happened as it did, so that I don't have to tell you whether I think contingency or determinism is the way to go in thinking about these 2 years. But it's one of those, and I advise, I encourage people to think about these two moments, because it gives you a sense, I think, vivid sense of the problems historians always face in trying to sort out various levels of causation, right? This is Dariush's question again about how do you relate various kinds of processes to each other. In 1867, you see the growth of a Czech national movement that is democratic and absolutely insistent upon self-representation. At the same time, old estates in Hungary who want also representation, but want a kind of control of their lands that implies the crushing of Slovak, Romanian, Croat, Serb representation. So it's a point out of which this solution emerges that seems necessary. But again, Jim, as you're aware, we have all of these individual contingent events to take place that make it possible. So I don't know what to say. It's something that one can continue to return to, and I'll stop with that because I think time is limited. But it's something that I would encourage people to think about.
Time indeed is limited, and I unfortunately have to draw this to a close. I want to thank John Connolly for this talk and this terrific exchange. I know there were multiple hands still up in the queue, and I apologize for not being able to get to you. For those wanting to purchase the book, if you use the Princeton University Press website, you can receive a 30% off for the price and free shipping if you order by August 31st. And if you use the code WC-FG, that's WC-FG, and that's from the Princeton University Press website. And I want to invite those of you in our audience back to the seminar next week on Monday, August 3rd. We will be discussing Island Stories, an Unconventional History of Britain, with Cambridge University historian David Reynolds, with commentators Laura Mayhall of Catholic University and Dane Kennedy of George Washington University. And 3 weeks from today, on August 17th, the Washington History Seminar will feature Anne Applebaum's new book, The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. So thank you, John. Thank you, folks behind the scenes. Thank you, Christian. Thank you to our audience. And in the meantime, till next week, take care and be safe. Good night.